welcome to the latest Being Well Together webinar. This month we'll be looking at indoor air quality and the impact on cognitive function and productivity and well-being. Whilst we just assemble everybody, we'd just like to play a brief video explaining some of the BSc initiatives around well-being.
Interested in the well-being of your organization? Do you find it difficult to know where to start or how your existing well-being offering is working? We have worked with experts to create holistic well-being solutions suitable for organizations at any stage, including our unique Being Well Together program, the integrated solution for all your health, safety, and well-being needs. Our research indicates that only 49% of companies have a written well-being strategy, and most of those do not measure effectiveness. Our range of solutions help you to identify gaps in well-being provision, providing clear guidance on how you can address them. Becoming a supporter of the Being Well Together program means access to tools and resources, allowing you to effectively develop and implement a health, safety, and well-being strategy in a joined-up, holistic way. You will see the health and well-being of your workforce improve and make the most of your investments. The Being Well Together program is available from British Safety Council or Mates in Mind, both registered charities.
Welcome back, everybody, and thanks for joining. I'm delighted to announce that we have Dr. Julie Riggs, who will be speaking for this month's webinar. Julie has worked within the health and safety profession for almost 30 years in the UK and worldwide, with diverse knowledge in a variety of industries, delivering effective health, safety, and well-being management programs, which includes compliance, business strategy, risk management policies and procedures, training, and best practice projects. Julie describes herself as an academic practitioner with a strong self-reflection and critical appraisal quality. Her strengths are influencing and leading health and safety, acting as an agent of change. She has a strong technical and management knowledge and a proven record of implementing successful projects in complex organizations. I'll now hand over to Julie to begin this webinar. And there will also be contributions from Marcus Herbert, our head of wellbeing. Sorry, I've got football on my mind from the weekend. And if any of you would like to ask any questions, we have a Q&A function as part of this webinar. So please post your questions in that area, and we will address them at the end. Over to you now, Julie.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you for the warm welcome as well, and welcome to everyone joining our webinar today. And so, as David said, I'm going to take you through indoor air quality and understand a little bit about the impact on your cognitive function, but also looking at productivity and how this links with well-being. Okay, so let's get started. Welcome to this session. We're going to start with a simple quiz. So if you'd like to participate, and it's completely anonymous, grab your phones, use your QR scanner and line up to the code on the screen, and it will take you to a link for some simple questions that you can participate as we're going to go through. You'll also see as well at the bottom of the slide, we have some pink commentary boxes as well. So if you'd like to contribute your thoughts around some of the questions, please do pop them into the chat as well at the same time. So in this session, we're going to be discussing how air quality enters through our nose and it travels around our body. We're going to understand a few key terms. We're going to review the impact on indoor air quality on the cognitive function of the brain. And part of that as well, we're going to use some examples. So we're going to look at a little bit about the impact of carbon dioxide or CO2 and perfumes. And finally, we're going to be discussing some of the emerging issues of brain health. Okay, so we're going to take a little bit just to understand that unconscious action you take every day, breathing. And we totally take it for granted. yet it's a vital function for our body and our brain. Every breath supplies our blood with oxygen, and it also removes metabolic waste in the form of carbon dioxide. And you take approximately 20,000 breaths a day. So if you want to visualize that in volume, if you replace the content of a 5-gallon water bottle that you often see sitting aloft of a water cooler, if you substitute that water with air, you'll breathe an equivalent of 600 bottles every day. The air itself, it consists of oxygen, nitrogen, and the remaining is small amounts of argon, carbon dioxide, and other gases and water. And it's that 1% that we're most interested in. It holds dusts and chemical components and biological agents. And the impact from these variables can affect our health, both physiologically and psychologically. They can also affect our perception of our environment, and they can determine whether our surroundings are conducive and comfortable for us. Air quality itself, it is such a broad subject, but in this session, we're only going to focus briefly on the impact to our brains and the need for us to link air quality within our wellbeing programs. So we'll start by looking a little bit about the definition of indoor air quality, or IAQ. And what you'll notice, it's not just physical conditions. So often when we talk about poor air quality, we talk about lungs and respiratory conditions, but there's also a link to psychological, which we're going to be talking about today. There's also a very strong case to invest in this area due to the strong impact on productivity and performance. And research looking at productivity is huge. I'm going to look at 1 or 2 examples today and why maybe as a chess player or a stock investor, air quality might actually be quite critical to you. Air quality is complex, and of course the quality of the air is important, but also is the perception. So air quality doesn't even have to be bad, but if you perceive the quality of the air is poor, so maybe there's an odor that you don't like, or maybe the environment is too hot for you, you can still have associated short-term symptoms just from the perception. So a quick question for you regarding perception and control over your environment, and please use the commentary box to give your answer. Temperature in the workplace can be a cause of discomfort for occupants. So what percentage of facility managers have installed a fake thermostat in the workplace? And I'll leave you to have a little think about that, and we'll talk about that answer in a second. And so you can see from these bullet points, this really is a health crisis that we're talking about, yet still often it's unspoken about, or when we consider it, we don't consider just how extensive it is. And often when I'm talking about air pollution, I often refer to it as a sleeping giant of the future. And you can see this is the reason why. We can see in the UK Environmental Audit Committee, they believe that air pollution is a public health crisis. You can see that indoor air is considered one of the top 5 health hazards in the world. We know that at least 50% of all illnesses are considered to be caused or aggravated by poor air. So what we're able to say from this is it's very much preventable. There's a huge cost to our society. The NHS industry in particular is enormous. If you just take asthma as an example, we have some of the highest asthma rates in the world. The NHS spend £1 billion treating asthma cases every single year. What we need to be doing is looking upstream as to the causes of them. And of course, there are a variety of reasons why people have asthma, including genetics, but huge contributing factors from our environment are also a cause. You can expect anything between 10 to 200 times more polluted indoor air than outdoor air. And we have unknown levels of chemical components that relate to cancer and birth defects. You might have seen in the news there's been lots of talk about forever chemicals, so PFAS. Key message here is, like a considerable amount of health issues, it is preventable, and we need to raise the agenda and start educating the world on the long-term health effects. Most of the toxins in our air are at low levels, but they shouldn't be discarded as harmless. There is an accumulative effect within our bodies that we must consider as well. So there's no doubt, there's no question any longer that the extent of contamination in the air we breathe is serious. But like many health topics, it's sometimes a latent reaction to years of low-level exposure, which causes complications in how to actually understand where the source of those issues are. It's difficult to make those direct correlations. So let's go back to my question about facility managers. Well, we know 73% in a survey in 2003, 73% of facility managers have actually installed a fake thermostat. And the reason for that is that perception that the occupants have of control of their own environment is just as strong. It gives a greater level of satisfaction, less complaints, less ill health symptoms. Hence why when we talk about air quality, we should also think about the perception of what our occupants think about the air. So let's just talk about outdoor air just for a moment. And you might be aware BSC have a campaign of Time to Breathe. And this is an important factor of indoor air quality. There have been a number of studies looking at the impact of outdoor air on occupants. Many have focused on traffic fumes, those ultrafine particles, black carbon, nitrogen dioxide. And we're all probably aware of the very tragic case of the young girl Ella's death in February 2013, caused by respiratory failure, severe asthma, with air pollution being a contributing cause. The combined effects of ambient air pollution and household air pollution is associated with 7 million premature deaths annually. So there's a lot of research in this area. As an example, pregnant women who live within 50 meters of a major road exposed to traffic fumes can increase their odds of miscarriage by 50%. And of course, there are other variable factors that can contribute towards that, but we know that there is certainly an association there. So when we start thinking about outdoor air, we really have no control over it. And the weather and the climate also can make differences. So outdoor pollutants will build up in low atmosphere due to temperature inversion. So this is when you have cold air will trap pollutants under a warm air current. And this can be exacerbated, particularly during certain pollutant sourcing times, such as traffic, rush hour. Concentrations can rise pretty rapidly during that time, and it only starts to diminish when the heat starts to clear or you get a breeze, a wind driving through. However, those pollutants then become trapped in indoor air spaces, and there is really no dispersion other than opening a window or using some kind of air cleaning device there. So as more of us are working from home now, many people don't have the benefit of an office HVAC system with filters. So they're more than likely to be exposed to indoor air pollutants will have increased. And of course, as we start to look to the increase of heating costs, which has affected people dramatically over the last 6 to 9 months, it's predictable that people are less likely to open a window for fresh air. So therefore, we're likely to see more of a pollutants build up indoors. So our noses really are the gatekeepers to our lungs. Distinct odours all carry molecules that trigger our receptors in our nose, and also our emotions to odours as well. Scientists estimate that we remember as little as 5% of what we see, but as much as 35% of what we smell. And this is because our sense of smell is most closely connected with our hippocampus, and that's the part of the brain that stores memories. And our brains perform less of a filter to reach that space when we inhale and we smell different odours. So again, use the commentary box. What's your favourite and least favourite sense? And what memories do they stimulate? And I'm sure we've all had experiences of that, whether it's, a particular sweet that you can smell, it may be a particular sort of being outside in the fresh air. There's lots of things that stimulate memory and sense more so than ever. And I'll talk about why that's important at the moment as to how scent is now being used in marketing. Our bodies are actually very efficient at removing some pollutants. So we'll sneeze or we'll cough them out, and that's thanks to the tiny cilia hairs and mucus that's in our nose and our throat. We also have microphalanges that are found in our liver, spleen, and different connective tissues of our body. So think of them a bit like Pac-Man. They're roaming around your body and they're destroying microbes and invaders. So these are natural defenses that build up over our evolution to protect us against what we're breathing in. However, consider how rapidly our environment has changed, particularly over the last 200 years, industrial revolution. Our bodies have not adapted to the amount of chemicals and particulates that we breathe in. Just something as simple as cutting wood. 200 years ago would have been done by hand. Now we're using bandsaws, jigsaws, so those particulate matters are much smaller and our bodies can't defend against them. In this slide, you'll see I've provided some examples of indoor pollutants, which can be generated from mold, VOCs from furnishings and furniture, building materials, chemical fumes from cleaning, paints, combustible gases, radon, even insects, dust mites, animal hair, dander. All of that can contribute towards this mix, toxic mix within your homes and workplaces. Aside from indoor pollutants, external air also becomes concentrated as it filters into that indoor environment. And with all these hundreds of different variable compounds, typical immediate health effects can include eye, nose, and throat irritation. For some people, it can be headaches, migraines, nausea, fatigue, and even the feeling of dizziness. Reactions to indoor air pollutants can be very individual, and they're determined by many factors such as gender, age, the activity you're doing within that exposed area, individual sensitivity. So some people can be sensitized to things like wood dust, repetitive exposure, or if you've got some pre-existing conditions, well, it can exacerbate it. Other health effects may show up years after exposure has occurred or only after long or repetitive periods of exposure. These effects, which can include respiratory disease, heart disorders, cancer, they can be severely debilitating or fatal. Mental health conditions, reduction in productivity, and also comfort have all been linked to air pollutions within our air. A frightening fact, for those that are familiar with COSH data sheets, manufacturer data sheets, if you have a look at the top of those data sheets, you'll see there is a CAS number, Chemical Extraction Service. So this is the global listing of chemicals. And every day, 33,000 chemicals are added to the database. It's a frightening figure. And often these chemicals, they're tested for safety in silos. So we actually have no idea about the combined effects of these chemicals. Another question for you. Have you ever experienced a reaction to the air? Do you get headaches from perfume? Do you get eye and nose irritation from cleaning products? It's actually quite familiar for a lot of the population. Okay, so let's understand a few terms here. You'll hear me and other people, when we talk about air quality, we often talk about different measurements. So just take a little moment to understand why that is. So concentrations of pollutions in the air, they're typically measured in units of mass, such as milligrams, and also volume of air, such as cubic meter. So in general terms, if we're measuring something that's a solid, a fume, or a dust, we use milligrams per cubic meter, although asbestos we express as fibres per milliliter of air. But if it's a vapour or a gas, we use parts per million. And to try and get an insight, if you want to visualize this, and some very simple illustrations there. So you can see on the left-hand side, we're talking about solids, so milligrams per cubic meter. And to get an idea of what 1 milligram per cubic meter is, if you take a football or a soccer field and you fill it, the whole pitch, to the height of 1 meter of dust, 1 teaspoon is the equivalent of 1 part. So it just gives you an idea. And you can see on the right-hand side, if we talk for parts per million, same thing. So if you take 50 three-bedroom houses, you fill them with party balloons, 1 part per million is equivalent of 1 party balloon across all of those 50 houses. So what we're talking about is very, very small concentrations when we start talking about volumes and the differences that they will have. Again, if you're in the UK and you use the EH40 document, you look at COSH, you'll see often we talk about milligrams per cubic meter and parts per million. So it might help if you have seen this before to get familiar with the EH40, which is a helpful document. Other terms that you'll hear when we talk about air quality is size of a particulate. And we measure in microns, sometimes known as micrometers. So 1 micron is a millionth of a meter. So here we can see some examples. You can see we've got a hair strand, and that's typically between 50 and 70 microns in diameter. You can see we've got much smaller here, so fine beach sand, 90 microns in diameter. And sometimes you can see dust in a shaft of light that's coming into a fairly dim room. So the smallest size of that dust you can see generally will be around about 25 microns. Anything smaller than that is almost invisible to the human eye. So many of the particulates that we are breathing in are far too small for us to see. And sometimes we don't know we're being exposed to it. We don't know we're breathing it in. So remember when we talked about cutting wood earlier on? Well, that can be between 10 and 30 microns, but processing it can be much smaller. So we can produce as small as 5 microns, which bypasses all of those natural defenses. So the cilious hairs in your nose and the mucus that you've got in your nose and throat that capture it and you're able to sneeze or cough it out. And it's able to bypass that and against our natural defenses. So it's important to understand that size is important when we start talking about sizes of particles. And here's a very simple table here that shows you some ideas. And what you're seeing is on the left-hand side are the smallest particles, and on the right-hand side are the large and visible ones. So you might see there's some familiar ones in here. You can see beach sand, but you know you can't see bacteria with the human eye. And if you look at some of those particulates, things like flour dust and cement dust, you can see that they span. So you can see some of those larger particles, but not the finer, smaller sizes. And the reason why it's important, again, it bypasses those natural defenses that we have. Those microphalanges that I talked about, the Pac-Man that roams around your body, they're about 21 diameters in size, but they can't destroy everything because some pollutants, they're so small they can enter into other parts of our body. So this is why its size is important to us. The smaller the pollutant, the further it can travel. So mid-range particles, so PM10, they're 10 microns or less in diameter, and they're most likely to be lodged in the upper respiratory tract, things like pollen, pet dander, mold spores, dust mite particles, anything that's known to sort of trigger asthma episodes, allergic reactions, and general dust. Sometimes if you're in a very dirty environment, if you blow your nose, you'll see the particles that come out. Finer particles, so PM 2.5 or less in diameter, this is the stuff that's too small to see. So bacteria, molds, pollen, parts of tobacco smoke as well, burning candles, they're all invisible to us. And that travels to the lower part of the respiratory tract. Then you have very fine particles, PM1, and this is where we're talking about viruses, exhaust gases. They travel further into the recesses of our lungs. And then we have ultra-fine particles. This is 0.1 micron or less in diameter. Things like traffic fumes, biomass, fires, they can travel around our body using our blood system. These small particles, they can travel to liver, spleen, bone, reproduction system, kidneys, and also our central nervous system leading to our brain. So have a little think. How long do you think it takes for the air for you to breathe in to reach your brain? And we'll talk about that in a second. So how does something that you breathe in get to your brain? As we breathe in air into our lungs, there is a gas exchange that occurs between our blood and the air. Our lungs, they contain 5 lobes, and they're filled with small spongy sacs called alveoli. And these alveolar walls are extremely thin. They're about 0.2 microns, so tiny, and they're covered in thin blood vessels. As we breathe in, oxygen diffuses into the red blood cells and releases back the used carbon dioxide that we then breathe out. And we exhale around 4 to 5%. The oxygen initially will travel to our heart, and then it's pumped around the rest of our body. But it's not just oxygen that diffuses into the blood. Because many of those particles of pollution are so small, they can travel around with that gas exchange. They accompany the oxygen and they spread around our body. And our blood is really being the vehicle for that. These pollutants can travel to other organs, but they can also cross our brain's blood vessels into brain tissue and cause inflammation. So how long did that take from breathing in to affecting your brain? Actually, it takes 4 seconds. So it's very quick what's happening. So we've learned why air quality is important and how it travels to the brain. And I mentioned earlier there are many factors regarding the recipients, including the age. Air pollution impact starts before we're even born. There are black carbon particles emitted by that incomplete combustion of fossil fuels such as diesel engine or wood-burning stoves. Those particles have been found in the lungs and the brain of fetuses. Children are more vulnerable, exposed to air pollution as well, because they're still developing their organs, their immune system, their neurological system. 90% of brain development happens by the age of 4. And because children have much lower body weight, children breathe in a relatively greater volume of air than adults do. And thus, because of that greater volume, they're being exposed to a much greater body burden. And what I mean by body burden is the amount of particulate chemicals that are stored in your body at any particular time. And it's approximately 700 contaminants that are in your body right now that your body is struggling to remove. Again, those natural defenses. There are numerous studies that link the relationship between babies and children and exposure to fine particulate matter pollution. And we know that they're linked to things like poorer behavioural function, they lower IQ, lower memory and cognitive performances. And there's also very strong links with children who experience problems and anxiety and depression symptoms as well. So if you consider the actions of a parent when they bring home a new baby and they bring them into the house, new furniture, new furnishings, plastic matting, decorated the room, they've probably closed the window to keep the room warm, heat the room. And if you imagine that's to a baby and they're developing lungs, the impact that that has. The Lancet in 2020 listed air pollution as one of the 12 most important risk factors for dementia. And of course, there are, again, whenever we talk about health issues, we're always very cautious around this because there's not always a direct linear relationship. So there are other influences around dementia risk, again, including genetics, health condition, age, etc., as often is the case. And it's quite difficult sometimes with health effects to draw that linear relationship because health can sometimes be latent and difficult to actually conclusively state that there is a major contributing cause. So researchers have been looking at oxidizing stress, and that's the imbalance of toxic molecules inside of our cells and the antioxidants that we need to remove them. And this is being connected to the onset of dementia. And we know that air pollution can restrict blood flow in the arteries. It can lead to higher blood pressure and an increase of stroke. Both factors are considered major contributors towards dementia. We know there's high rates of psychiatric illnesses such as depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, personality disorders have all been linked to air pollution. Lack of oxygen, or sometimes you can have a substance asphyxiation, a compound that can reduce oxygen, that also can affect brain tissue. Heavy metals, mixed organic solvents have been associated with disorders including mood changes, multifunctions, and mental slowing, memory loss, concentration problems. It is a depiction, you may have heard this story within Lewis Carroll's 1865 Alice's Adventure in Wonderland. Carroll actually resided quite near the top hat factories, and potentially he witnessed the effects of mercury on the central nervous system of employees who were basically in the factory, and they were curing the felt on top hats using mercury, breathing in those fumes, and then were showing symptoms from it: slurred speech, difficulty with coordination, so forth. And hence we believe it was an inspiration for the Mad Hatter character that you see in the book. But let's look at some very simple examples here, and let's discuss a common gas that surrounds us. Actually, we even contribute towards it, and that's carbon dioxide. So that's the air that we breathe out. Typically, when we think about indoor concentrations, they can be anything from 380 to 2,500 parts per million. So remember, it's a gas, so it's parts per million. If we look at the workplace exposure limits in the UK, or the EH40 document, COSH, related to COSH, it enforces a maximum of 5,000 parts per million over an 8-hour time-weighted average. And that's to protect us against undesirable changes in acid-based balance of our body. Although carbon dioxide workplace exposure limits are rarely exceeded unless you're working specifically with carbon dioxide. But we know actually that even lower concentrations of 1,000 parts per million, which actually is very common in most workplaces, have been shown to affect the body physically and psychologically as well. Carbon dioxide that exceeds 800 parts per million sometimes will result in a range of health and comfort factors. These can include headaches, fatigue, eye symptoms, nasal symptoms, respiratory tract symptoms. We know that migraine sufferers typically can be affected by carbon dioxide. Occupants will also feel 2 to 3 degrees warmer than actual temperature. So this is a well-being issue now, where I'm feeling warmer, but the temperature is actually set correctly. So we know that people are very sensitive to those air changes and can contribute towards some conditions. And as I said, migraines, 97% of migraine sufferers will experience that above 800 to 1,000 parts per million. We even know mental health conditions such as stress, anxiety and depression have significant contributing factors. In fact, when we look at testing medication for anxiety, we have in the past actually induced an anxiety reaction in a healthy participant by using carbon dioxide to create that. So it very, very interestingly linked with the brain. Actually, 16 years ago, I conducted a study looking at slight elevations of carbon dioxide in students performing reactional performance tasks. So we were looking at levels around 1,000 parts per million. So the way that we generated that is literally close doors and windows to get sort of elevated levels there. And what we found is a reduction of 30% in their cognitive ability, so their decision making, their reactions to tests that we were giving them. This study has actually been repeated several times since and had very similar results, around about a 30% drop at 1,000 parts per million. So think about when you sit in a stuffy meeting room, you're feeling tired, how does it affect your performance? Carbon dioxide is a pretty simple and inexpensive type of gas to measure. And generally we treat this as a basic measurement because it tells us there's not enough air exchange that's happening in that space. And if there's not enough air exchange and there's not enough dilution happening, it's more than likely that you'll have a buildup of other types of contaminants in that space. So we don't often, when we talk about air quality, we think about poor performance. However, consider 30% reduction, and that could be quite critical in certain occupations. So you think about airline pilots, or maybe you need to make a strategic decision about something, or perhaps even a chess move. So with the prize money, US dollars at 1.6 million for the champion chess tour, a slight reduction in strategic thinking could be the difference between first and second place. So researchers have been looking at how indoor air quality affects the quality of strategic decision making based on data from official chess tournaments. So they've analysed a unique data set reading air quality. So they've been looking at carbon dioxide, particulate matter and also temperature. And they've been looking inside tournament rooms against the quality of 30,000 moves by 121 players across 3 tournaments in Germany in 2017, 18 and 19. Each of those tournaments lasted 2 months, so a huge amount of really good data that they produced. And the researchers then compared those moves against the optimal ones determined by a chess computer, and found that even with a slight elevation in poor air quality, the likelihood that players would make a mistake increased by 1.2%, and that severity of error rose by 10.8%. We've also done similar studies looking at the stock exchange and looking at strategic decisions. So that, again, we looked at the US and also 100,000 investors in Germany, in a German brokerage firm as well. And particulate pollution was analysed against their decision of investment. And even with one standard deviation, we associated almost a 12% reduction in same-day returns. So when you consider those strategic decisions you're making, think about some of those occupations that you have as well. It could be long-distance lorry drivers, somebody that works with really detailed types of data like accountants, the impact potentially it can have on your productivity and performance. I do want to talk a little bit about perfumes as well. I mentioned about scent at the beginning, and I think it's important to look at this. Scented candles, scented marketing, scented products, they're on the increase. And you only need to look at your supermarket aisle of air fresheners to see that growing industry. Scent, as I mentioned earlier, is most closely linked to our memory than any other sense. Hence why these emotions that are generated when scents stimulate our brains. However, 95% of the chemicals that we use in fragrances today are synthetic compounds. They're derivative from petroleum, including benzene, which we know is associated with certain types of cancers like leukemia. There's other types of toxins and sensitizers, which we know cause allergic reactions, respiratory disorders like asthma, as well as neurological disorders. 84% of these ingredients have never been tested for human toxicity, or if they have been tested, they've been tested to a minimal amount. Many of those chemicals are nerve toxins, and we know that they have recognized effects on the central nervous system. Studies have shown that inhaling fragrances can cause circulatory changes and electrical activities in the brain. These can trigger, again, migraines, headaches, the ability to concentrate, dizziness, fatigue. There's research that suggests that perfume products may contribute towards ADHD. Aluminium in aerosol form may be readily absorbed into the brain through the nasal passage, and studies have shown that regular use of these products, in particular things like deodorant aerosols, can increase the risk of Alzheimer's by as much as 3 times. So as well as well-being and comfort factors, we also have to think that people are sensitive to chemicals and scents. In fact, 15 to 30% of the population have some type of sensitivity to perfumes and fragrances. So sometimes that can be quite difficult to avoid in a public space. Have a think about how often do you wear scent? How often do you have chemicals or other types of scented products around you? Is it needed? Is it an unnecessary pollutant that we're adding to our indoor space? So there was a 2004 research paper that concluded that mothers who use air fresheners daily suffered almost 10% more headaches than those who use them less than once a week. And of those mothers who used air freshener regularly, 16% suffered from depression, compared with only 12% of those mothers who never used air freshener. And again, caveat that with there are lots of contributing causes, but we know that there is some interesting data that we're starting to see trending from this. Ingredients like formaldehyde, parabens, toluene, they've all been established in the scientific literature as causing or likely causing cancer, birth defects, hormone disruptors, infertility, and so much more. And yet they're legally allowed in products. Some of those chemicals can store in our body and our fatty tissue forever. Remember I talked about forever chemicals earlier on. Remember I talked about those body burdens, 700 contaminants that we just can't remove from our body. They are persistent. And these chemicals are found in scent as well. Fragrance formulas are considered trade secret. So manufacturers only have to state that there is a fragrance on the label. They do not need to identify the chemical makeup. Unlike if you buy food, drugs, cosmetics, they need to list all the ingredients on the label. For some reason, we have this strange loophole for scent. Fragrance-free or unscented does not actually guarantee that there is no fragrant chemical in there. It just means there's no perceivable odor. You can see I put some details on the screen here as well of some research that was conducted in 2021 looking at the impact of fragrances, and they looked across 4 countries, US, Australia, UK and Sweden. And you can see when we start looking at some of the data that's come out the back of this, it talks about how many people are being exposed to fragrant products on a regular basis, but also the impact on people that have asthma or who have autistic types of conditions as well. They report adverse health effects from fragrance products. You can also see the amount of lost days that have been from people being exposed to fragrance products and have suffered an illness from it. And what we can tell you as well is that there are vulnerable individuals who have a higher percentage. And so again, we look at asthmatics, and people who are autistic have more lost work days because of it. Scent is big business, and it's now being used in influencing your decision making on purchasing goods, whether you know it or not. And the whole marketing of products using aroma has certainly increased, as I mentioned. And actually, if we look at the start of that, it came really back to Rolls-Royce. And it's a very interesting story about how we started with looking at marketing and scent. So in 1955, the classic Silver Cloud won Rolls-Royce, and it was tailored with red Wilton wool carpets and walnut for the doors and dashboard. And there were 2,395 of them that went into manufacture, and they were the high quality of craftsmanship. They were known as the spirit of ecstasy. It was the pride and place for Rolls-Royce. However, by the competitive mid-90s, customers began complaining that their brand new Rolls-Royce didn't live up to the expectations that those previous glamorous models that they had. And so Rolls-Royce decided to do some reflection, and they decided to evaluate a Rolls-Royce 1965 Silver Cloud 2. And they used it as a reference point to try and understand what the luxury was with that product. And that also included looking at the different odours and smells that came off it. And would you believe there are 800 different distinct odours that come off the car? And that's everything from leather, mahogany, underseal, oil, felt, and so on. So many of these products that you saw traditionally in a car have now been replaced with more suitable types of materials for safety implications. So plastics, foams, much more than wood and wool. Therefore, Rolls-Royce decided to recreate the smell of a traditional car by artificially infusing a synthetic type of smell into the material. And this alluring smell became very successful. The manufacturers then bottled this brand, and this is what we call the new car smell. And it's a familiar tactic. So if you bought a new car or you get your car validated, you can smell it. And it gives that sense of luxury, clean, a sense that we're interacting with. So Rolls-Royce had invariably become the innovator behind scent marketing, where a customer becomes attracted to a product with sometimes unconsciously understanding that relationship. So smell and pleasant odours, they can skew our senses. They can skew sort of what we visually see and audibly hear. So scent trade marketing has continued. There's lots of brands that you may recognise because of their smell. You know, Disney have trademarked their own smell. The Japanese phone companies have also created new tech smells that are built into your phone. So when someone rings you, it gives a particular scent, which I think is interesting. We're also seeing electronic sensing or e-sensing, digital smells. Recently, I've seen that we are putting scent capsules into water bottles, so it gives the illusion of tasting a flavour even though there's no flavour there. So all of these elements are building up into this toxic soup in our air, and we have no idea of the impact. The products have been created faster than the research can be conducted to keep up. So measuring IQ is complex, and that's the interesting thing about air quality testing. Unlike taking a noise sample, you use one bit of kit, that's quite straightforward. But for air, you need lots of different types of kit. Organic gases are different to volatile organic compounds, VOCs. Total VOCs don't include formaldehyde, which is one of the most common VOC. Particulate matter is different to mold. So therefore, there's a bit of reluctance sometimes to uptake this subject. Indoor air quality is often seen as an invisible hazard as well, and when we discuss it, we associate that discussion with our environment and physical health, but as we've seen, without doubt, you know, it affects much more broadly than just our respiratory lungs. So the ability to breathe clean, unpolluted air to protect our brain function has huge emotional, economic and moral reasoning. 99% of the global population breathes unclean air, and it does not meet the World Health Organization guidelines. In urban areas where pollution is high, brain health inequality is now forming. Individuals are starting to take approach to engaging more in indoor air quality debates, which is brilliant, and raising awareness through training, introducing policies, adopting the topics into their wellbeing program, discussing the concerns with facility managers and OHS practitioners. Some forward organisations are also displaying their air quality readings. So in this particular example, you can see that the owners of the Apricot Tree Cafe in Ontario in Canada have a little QR code where you can go on and actually have a look at what the air quality is at any time. So it's great to see some of these initiatives coming through. Practical things that you can do that will improve individuals' well-being and health, whether in the home or the workplace. We often focus on the management of someone's health, but as I mentioned earlier on, we need to look upstream and understand some of the causes. And sometimes they're not as obvious, or they can be complicated, but the first start really is just to engage with the conversation and being transparent about it. So it is a big subject, and my top 3 takeaways for today is IAQ is complicated, but it doesn't have to be, and it doesn't have to be expensive either. It's about controlling unnecessary sources, ventilating buildings. Understand the well-being of your building envelope. So monitoring, often building facility management will do this already, but be familiar with it. What is the impact? And adopt IAQ into your wellbeing programs. It's about educating, air testing, controlling pollution sources, monitoring, having a process for reporting, investigating issues. People are saying they have headaches or they're struggling with the environment, to have a really open and transparent types of conversations. So good indoor air quality programs are essential for the lungs of a building to be well. IAQ is increasingly being embedded into corporate wellbeing strategies to deliver a healthier and happier work environment. And I mentioned earlier, if you expect the food you eat and the water you drink to be uncontaminated, you should also expect the air we breathe to be safe. As a society, we need to take the conversation about air quality more serious. Further investment in research is needed. And it is time for researchers to develop the evidence that will allow government, businesses and individuals to demand global standards for indoor air quality, to reduce emissions, exposure and harm, and achieve a fundamental right to breathe clean air. The risks from indoor air pollution affects everyone. Unlike other types of health initiatives where you can make a choice about your actions or your behaviour to influence your own health, indoor air quality requires all of us to come together as a collective community to champion the change on improving the air that we breathe. So please do take a look at our Breathe campaign on our website and be part of the conversation. Be part of raising the agenda. That's going to make a difference to all of our lives. And that starts with creating your own legacy, your actions, your contribution to change. Thank you very much for your time today. I do hope I've stimulated some further thoughts and dialogue in your workplace about indoor air quality and the connection with looking after your own health and the well-being of others. Thank you. David, over to you.
Yes, thanks, Julia. That was brilliant. I mean, it was a really comprehensive overview of the issues affecting the industries involved in clean air policy. We have a few questions, but I'll hand over to Marcus now. Not Marcus Rashford, Marcus Herbert. See if Marcus has any questions as a result of your presentation.
Well, firstly, apologies to the attendees thinking that Marcus Rashford was going to be joining us as a guest speaker today, and now you're stuck with me instead. Apologies for that. Maybe we can arrange for him on a future webinar. So yeah, I mean, normally I would actually share what's on the slide here, but just before I do, Julie, thanks so much for going into the level of detail that you've gone into with your session today. And I know actually that despite the amount of detail that you've gone into today, I know that this is still only really scratching the surface of not only your knowledge, but also the topic. And the reason why I can say that is because of your book on the actual topic, which is a 500-pager on indoor air quality. So I'm yet to get through this, but yeah, Julie, thanks so much for sharing so much wisdom on the topic today. I do have a question for you. And before I ask the question, I'll just share with those that have attended today how we're currently operating with these workplace wellbeing webinar series. So this is the 5th that we've delivered this year. It's a monthly webinar series, and each month we have a guest speaker on a specialist topic area in order to share their insights and to share some of their wisdom and direction for you as an audience. And by attending the webinar today, you are welcome to scan the QR code, which is on your screen, to access a 30-minute complimentary consultation with one of our wellbeing team in order to have a conversation about the wellbeing needs of your organization. So this is not wellbeing for you as an individual, this would be wellbeing within your role within your organization. And if that happens to now especially touch on the topic of indoor air quality, then of course that's something that we can have a conversation with you about. When you scan the QR code, it will just ask you for a series of details. You can just complete those. You can scan the QR code now and actually fill in the details after the webinar itself. And then, of course, around about this time next month, we'll be delivering our next workplace wellbeing webinar. So keep an eye out for that when we actually release the information on it. So, Julie, a question for you is that obviously if somebody has attended the webinar today and this is the first time that they've ever really explored the detail that's involved in indoor air quality, and they might have a level of responsibility for the well-being of their organization, whether that be they're in a health and safety role or a HR position. Is there anything that you would recommend that they do to start their journey of addressing indoor air quality? In particular, if they have team members that are not just based in one working location, if they might be part of that hybrid workforce group where people are working more predominantly from home. Is there one kind of source of either recommendation or information that you would point them in the direction of?
I think it's really interesting because nobody actually owns indoor air quality at the moment. So if you look at the HSE website, there's not very much on there. If I look across the British Occupational Hygiene Society, which is another fantastic organisation, it's more dealing with occupational types of hygiene rather than some of the low-level types of topics that we're talking about today. So actual access to some of these resources can be really varied sometimes. But I think the first thing to do is actually is around education and understanding what air quality means, and that will help you a little bit to be able to identify some of the sources that we talked about. So today I've talked about two very simple sources that actually can be very impactful for organisations. Scent, that's very easy for us to be able to control that. And I'm not sort of saying to people, you know, throw out everything that's got scent in it, but it's about being reasonable about it and the amount that you're exposed to. So you don't necessarily have to take readings for that. You can sense it, you know that. Carbon dioxide is another really interesting one. So we know that it's not until you get to 5,000 parts per million that we start talking about the impact on its health. But if people are saying to you that I'm getting headaches, I'm struggling a little bit, then that's the time to have just a conversation, as you would do if it was just normally wellbeing or occupational health. The CO2 one is a really interesting one for me, and the first time I became aware of it was around working for a college where we actually moved from a very old building that was ventilated at cast iron radiators to a complete sealed building that had HVAC system in there, and you couldn't open a window anywhere. And for 6 months we had complaints of people having headaches, feeling very hot even though the temperature was being monitored accurately, a lot of sickness. And it turned out it's just the carbon dioxide levels were too high. And it was a conversation with facility managers. So start those conversations, start educating and start gathering some data, and have a process where people can actually come and talk to you if they are struggling with headaches and maybe having problems with respiratory, and do have that process to allow people to raise.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Julie. Well, we've got a couple of minutes left. So, David, have we had any questions submitted during the actual webinar itself? I know you've mentioned there's been a few encouraging comments of engagement, but any questions at all?
Yes, some great feedback actually, Julie. And let's address one of the big overarching questions. This one's from Nicola Schoon. She's asked, how do we get air quality onto the mainstream risk assessment agenda not the industries where a hazard is recognised, e.g. working with chemicals, but office environments, shops, etc. Do you think attitudes will ever change? When we think about lessons learned so far, the COVID-19 pandemic, we need to recognise that some people are more susceptible to common pathogens such as viruses.
I think COVID, thank you for that, David, and thank you, Nicola, for posting that. I think COVID certainly got us thinking much more about what we're breathing in, although I do think that we are now, that initial heightened knowledge around it is starting to wane a little bit again, and I think people are now sort of that familiarity, and some of that has been lost. It's always a very difficult subject. I've been talking about indoor air quality for probably about 15 years now, and doing a lot of training around it myself. And I find that it's always subjects that people relate to, particularly with senses, which is why I talk about perfume. Or if I talk about vaping as an example, it's very visual as well as the smell, you know, the changes that we think about vaping to cigarette smell because the smells are different and things like that. If you can talk about something that people can relate to, then you can broaden that subject. Very difficult when you're talking about something that's completely invisible. I don't know I'm breathing it in. I don't get an immediate health effect from it. It's maybe a week, 2 weeks, 6 months later. That's the challenges that we have. So I think doing something that's very visual, where we're actually able to, the cafe in Ontario is a classic example of you can actually see what the air quality is like, and it gives you an idea. So those visual things. There have been a number of organisations that have tried to develop little products that you can plug into your computer or put on your desk, and it goes green if it's good and red if it's bad. But the problem with that is that it only tests for certain things. So it can't test for, you're going to test for bacteria, you're going to test for viruses, you're testing for dust, you're testing for gases. That's the complication with it, that you need lots of different types of kit really to test for everything. But I do think talking about it more and talking about subjects that people can relate to, like I was saying, scent is a really good one to get people really engaged in the subject.
Excellent, thanks, Julie. Just to give you a massive compliment, we have a comment here in the Q&A. Absolutely brilliant presentation, easily understood, interesting, and described perfectly. Really enjoyed. Thank you. And I'll follow that up with a question. What standard is expected to be met for IAQ? Building regs determine minimum air changes, but is this sufficient? And are there other standards to be met?
Yes, so air changes definitely help because it's starting to dilute what's in our atmosphere. And it was like I was saying, if you take carbon dioxide reading, very, very simple, inexpensive way to take a reading, you can tell whether you've got enough air changes that are happening there and whether they're effective. The problem we have with air changes sometimes is we build a building, we put the ventilation system in, and then we're going to furnish it and we're going to put partitions up and we're going to do this, that, and other. And the building hasn't been designed for a particular activity, or we're going to put 20 people into a meeting room that's really only designed for 6. And it's the activities that we do in the room sometimes that then affect the air changes, unless you've got sensors that are monitoring that and adjusting. So air changes is definitely the first standard which really helps us with understanding where we should be. But with regards to other IAQ ratings, there are different organisations out there that are now starting to do some ratings. I actually put some ratings in my book as well to help people say, look, these are some of the standards. And where we've taken those standards from is research. Because if you look at the EH40 document, it will say that the standards are usually a lot higher because, you know, I mentioned about carbon dioxide being 5,000. We know much lower than that, the impact it has. So what we've got to do is lower those for IAQ standards, which are very different than occupational hygiene exposure. So there are organisations that are working on them. We've seen ISO standards that's starting to look at this. So I think it will get a lot better. But if we have measurements, I think that would really help with building owners, architects and so forth to understand what good air quality should look like for occupants. I do worry a little bit, I'm sorry if I'm going off track a little bit, but I do worry a little bit that we are, you know, we're putting buildings next to really busy roads and railway lines and really urban areas that are not helping with regards to air quality as well. And I particularly worry about housing that are going with often young families that buy these properties quite near to sort of really polluted traffic routes and so forth as well. So there is a lot that we need to do around not just the IQ standards, but planning laws as well. We worry about putting them onto contaminated soil, but what about the envelope of air that is around them as well?
Thanks, Julie. That's brilliant. I'm afraid we're pretty much out of time now. So I'm going to wrap this up. I'd just like to thank everybody for participating in today's webinar. Next month's webinar, we'll look at workplace wellbeing, and it's on the 27th of June. Details will be on the BSc website. For anybody who didn't manage to get all of this presentation, we will also be posting the whole presentation on our YouTube channel. So we look forward to welcoming you again next month. And thanks so much, Julie, and to Marcus for today's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.